of the 178 session. And we're delighted, obviously, it's going to be an excellent paper by Kieran McQuinn. So it's lovely that he's giving a talk today. And then they'll be followed by two discussants. So Kieran will operate over here and we'll let him do his talk. And then we'll try and create a good bit of time for questions online and questions. So when I bring up your slides?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
So
this is your one here, right?
Thank you very much to the Society for the opportunity to present. It's great to be here out here in UCD this afternoon. This is joint work with my colleagues, Paul Egan, who is logging in from the west of Ireland, just got his electricity back yesterday, and another west of Ireland man here, Donald O'Shea. And so you can see the title is Demographics, Higher Investment and the Potential Growth Rate of the Irish Economy. So essentially, I suppose, for those of us, for those of you familiar with the work that we do in the ESRI, typically on the macro economic side of things, we tend to do the quarterly economic commentary, which is, of course, the kind of assessment 4 times a year of the Irish economy, and essentially very much short-term forecasting in terms of how we see, where we see the economy now, but where we see it going over the next 12 to 18 months. And in between, from time to time, we also do what's now called the economic outlook, used to be called the medium-term review in years gone by. And that was essentially, and is essentially looking at the longer-term picture for the Irish economy. So where we see the economy over a possibly 5, 10, 15-year horizon, or even further down the tracks. And essentially, this presentation today is very much in that spirit. So those of us who are working on it typically tend to work in the short-term forecasting. So it is informed very much by that. But it is part of the kind of the longer term outlook, if you like, in terms of where we see the economy over a period of time. We are taking a rather long period in terms of our trajectory. So it's not just 5, 10 years. We actually go way out to 20, 30, 40 years even ahead. And I'll explain, if you like, the reasons and the rationale for that as we progress through the presentation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you just click down or click down. Page down. It's just a PDF. I don't know where's page down. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Which one do you use? That one?
Yeah,
there. Okay, so I suppose there's 2 aspects to the presentation then. Firstly, what we try to do is characterize Irish economic performance from 1995 to the present. And then as the second part, based on that, essentially, and based on our assessment or analysis, to basically then do our forecast out over into the longer term horizon. And I suppose if you look at it from 1995, typically, we also do, for instance, in the Institute, a lot of work on housing and on the financial sector. And so typically when we look at the period from 1995 to the present, we tend to take, roughly speaking, 3 different sub-periods, if you like, in terms of 3 different, if you like, coherent periods of growth or degrowth, if you like, as the case may be. So typically we look from the period initially from 1995 up to 2007, which I suppose essentially is regarded as the Celtic Tiger, classic Celtic Tiger period. And then, of course, you have the significant decline, the 2008 to 2012 period. Of course, if you like, this particular economy facing the particular implications of the global financial crisis. And then after that, from 2013 onwards, you have the post-GFC, as we call it, recovery period. Within that, though, there are various different subcategories again. So, for instance, if you take the Celtic Tiger period, from 95 to 2007, it's possible to kind of decompose that into an initial period of what we might call more sustainable growth, export-led growth initially from the mid-90s. And then by 2003, 2004, you saw the emergence of a credit bubble, very much obviously related to the housing market, which of course was ultimately unsustainable and not just had obviously particular implications for the housing market, but of course related implications for the financial sector as well. So that goes from maybe 2004, 2005 on to 2007. In the post-2013 period, of course, you can probably separate it out between the initial phase from 2013 to 2019. And then, of course, from 2020 onwards, you have COVID, and COVID does obviously have a big implication for some of the variables that you see in the presentation. You had big bounces, swings, depending on public health measures and the like, etc. So, but ultimately, I think, in any kind of assessment from 1995 onwards, the economy has been truly transform, not just the economy, but of course society as well. Just to put up in a snapshot, a few kind of variables just to capture that. We could, I suppose, list a variety or a litany of such variables, but just to put up a few headline ones. From 1995 to 2023, you can see population, 3.6 million in 95, 5.3 million in 2023. Arguably one of the more impressive variables in terms of its transformation is employment, the economy over doubling, 1.3 million to 2.7 million at the end of 2023. And of course, if we were to bring in the 2024 data, it would be even up again. Output per capita, and we've taken this, just normalized it such that 1995 is equal to 100. The output we use is in real terms, and it's also the particular output measure that we use throughout the presentation, which I'll discuss briefly in a minute. But you can see the huge increase from 100 to 174 in 2023. Exchequer receipts, just to underline, I suppose, the change in the fiscal position. This is in nominal terms. So if we look at it in per capita, you can see the government collecting around just over 3,800 euros per person in 1995. And then up until 2023, you're now talking about 16,500 euros, and up again if you were to take the 2024 data. Life expectancy I've included because based on work that my colleagues Adele Bergen and Seamus McGuinness have done, essentially when they were looking at trying to compare the economy here in the Republic with that in the north of Ireland, they felt that life expectancy was one of the better measures to use in terms of comparing the performance of economies across jurisdictions. And there you can see again, a very impressive life expectancy according to the WHO. Ireland was coming in at 34th in global tables in 1995, falling down to 9th by 2023. And again, life expectancy, of course, is a function of a variety of variables. So it is quite a good indicator of, I suppose, general improvement in living conditions, etc., in an economy. That's one measure, I suppose, and one snapshot of the transformation. The other, which we could use, is, of course, something like house prices to give an idea of the volatility over the period. So when you look at 1995 and compare it to 2023, huge improvements, huge transformation. But of course, within that period, we see huge volatility. This is house prices in nominal terms. So if we started with 1995 equaling 100, you can see how house prices escalated rapidly up to 2007, over 400. The largest increase in a lot of work we've done, categorizing it, comparing it across the OECD and Western economies, huge increase in prices. And then, of course, an almost equally calamitous fall in prices from 2007 through to 2012 when it reached its trough. And of course, thereafter, we see the significant increase in house prices since. So I think just generally, it's fair to say, the huge transformation we've seen in the economy, but also I think most macroeconomists back in 2012 and 2013, I was in the central bank at the time, I think if they were asked to forecast how the Irish economy would perform over the next 10 years, I think most of them would have under-forecast and significantly under-forecast how the economy has rebounded, really rebounded in a very, very strong and robust manner. Okay, so what do we do? I suppose, as I said, the study is motivated from the necessity to take a broader, longer-term perspective of the economy, but also I suppose a feeling that we have that the economy is possibly at a crossroads. We've had very strong, persistent growth over the last 10 years. Even in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had very, very strong growth in the economy. But maybe a sense that we're now moving arguably into a period of more subdued growth rates. And so what we want to do, and we'll articulate our reasons for that, or underlying reasons for that, particularly a crucial element, just seeing Chris coming in here, obviously being very well aware of it, a crucial element in any assessment of the Irish economy is the need to control for distortions in multinational related activity. So that's a crucial element, if you like, of what we try to do in terms of characterizing the economy. But we take a very standard, traditional solo growth model, and using the growth accounting calculations, we basically decompose the growth performance over the last 25 to 30 years. And then based on that, we then generate longer term forecasts for the economy. Obviously, in order to do that, we have to make some very specific assumptions, particularly around issues of variable and volatile as total factor productivity, and around issues such as investment rates and the average weekly working hours. And we outline our assumptions. And if I get a chance, maybe in the discussion, I'll outline some robustness analysis we've done to really try and prod those assumptions, because they are crucial assumptions, I suppose, in terms of how you see the economy moving forward. All of this we do in the future against the backdrop of a variety of different demographic forecasts, because of course what we've seen in the last 3 to 4 years, I suppose, is real volatility as far as population movements and demographic movements generally are concerned. We've seen, much higher than expected growth rates for a variety of reasons. So therefore, it's important that we would, if you like, use a variety of different population forecasts in terms of our assessments. And in doing so, we draw off work that our co-author, Paul Egan, would have done with another colleague at Bergen in looking at the structural demand for housing, which was published during the year. What do we find? Well, our analysis seems to bear out the assertion that the Irish growth rate looks set to modify over the coming years. And by the coming years, of course, I mean the longer term horizon. So, almost a feeling that maybe the rapid growth that we've experienced, both in terms of the post-2013 era, but also in the earlier Celtic Tiger era, that possibly is coming to an end. And mainly that's a function, I suppose, of changing demographics. But also as we move into the future, the issue of declining productivity growth rates, which we observe in Ireland, and we observe in many Western economies, we believe this is important longer term implications. And indeed, a lot of this work was motivated by work that myself and Carol Whelan here of UCD did in terms of looking at the performance of Euro area economies. And this was something which we clearly saw and identified using similar type of structure in terms of the apparent fall off in total factor productivity growth rates apparent across Western economies. And if you like, as we move forward beyond the kind of rapid growth phase that we've experienced as an economy, I think it's evident that slowdown in total factor productivity is going to impact the Irish economy as it has impacted most Western economies. In terms of our baseline forecast that we outline, we also do scenario analysis. And in particular, we look at issues around investment rates and the demographics. Investment we pick because it's very much obviously an issue of the day here in Ireland, probably buoyed on by the significant public finances and robustness of the public finances that we have, and of course the establishment of investment funds by the government, but also I suppose in recognition of the fact that there are clear infrastructure deficits have been identified as far as the domestic economy is concerned, most notably of course in areas such as housing, but across a variety of different areas. And so clearly I suppose a feeling that if we are to have more stable and sustainable growth in the future, greater rates of investment have a clear and important role to play. It's not just the domestic consideration. Of course, we've recently seen the European Commission report chaired by Mario Draghi, which of course very much made similar case for the European economy and the need for greater investment across Europe if you are to get out of, if you like, the kind of the recent slump in terms of growth that the European economy has been susceptible to. And of course, obviously over the longer term, maybe surprising to be talking about it, but certainly over the longer term, we see that population dynamics could give rise to demographic drag. And again, this is something Carol and I would have identified in European economies, something which is very definitely impacting the growth rate of the European economies at present, but which is something that will come down the tracks for Ireland in the years to come. Okay, in terms of the framework, very simple, standard Cobb-Douglas production function, the solo growth model. You can see Y is output A, total factor productivity, capital K, labor L, and the respective share, they're given by alpha equaling a third, implies the following growth accounting equation. If you look at growth rates, they're denoted by the dot. The important point here, just to point out, is that obviously these are fairly important assumptions in terms of the capital share, but we have done quite a lot of work, as I said, I may get to it in the discussion, quite a lot of work, if you like, doing robustness tests on these kind of key assumptions. So Donald wrote a paper published in the most recent commentary looking at the labor share and seeing how it stood up, if you like, to that assumption. And we also, of course, because the capital stock we use, we have to take a starting value for that capital stock, and we make specific assumptions around the capital output ratio being at its steady state value in 1995, then roll it out with a depreciation rate of 6%. Again, we stress test that to various different assumptions, just to make sure that our results aren't, if you like, unduly influenced by those assumptions. As I said, the national accounting issues are important, very important, clearly in an Irish context. And, you know, you can quibble and we could spend, I suppose, a day, if you like, discussing the relevant measures that should be used to counter and deal with these issues. We've taken the following perspective on it. So for output, we've followed a lot of work that our former colleague, John Fitzgerald, has done in using net national product market prices, mainly as it excludes depreciation, which has been particularly problematic in an Irish context. It does give rise to a certain inconsistency in the sense that we are looking at investment and capital stock on the other side. So one can argue that there is a certain inconsistency in taking that particular output measure. But as I said, we think there's been a lot of good work, and John has outlined in a number of papers reasons why it's a particularly good measure in an Irish context. And we have done, again, some sensitivity analysis looking at other output measures. And again, we don't see a huge change, if you like, in terms of our results based on that. For investment, again, GDP isn't the only variable, of course, impacted by multinational related issues or national accounting related issues. Investment clearly is as well, the headline investment level. So we take the modified series from the CSO. Modified series essentially deals with IP and aircraft leasing related issues. It doesn't remove all multinational related distortions, but it does remove quite a few in terms of, you know, as far as our analysis is concerned. Just to give you an idea of what that entails, and again, just to kind of highlight, I suppose, the kind of stark contrast that you can come up with from a policy perspective if you don't allow for these distortions. The headline figure here, the headline blue line, is the headline investment rate. So that would be headline investment divided by headline GDP. And the underlying is our measure. So that is our modified investment divided by our output measure. And of course, if you look at the two, you can see, particularly from 2013, 14 onwards, there's a stark contrast in the kind of policy implications which fall out. Headline rate would suggest, and again, you can see it bouncing up quite in a particularly volatile manner, but it suggests that there's almost a surplus, if you like, of investment in the economy, or too much almost investment in the economy, given the percentage rates, which you can read off the left-hand axis. If you use the underlying investment rate, of course, it's a much different perspective. Shows that there's far less investment in the economy than the headline figures would suggest. So again, just a very simple way of illustrating how using headline data can give at times a misleading impression as to where the actual position of the economy is at. A lot of the volatility in investment can be explained, I suppose, if you like, by the public finances. So here I've just outlined gross voted current and capital expenditure normalized by output. You can read the capital in the green line off the right-hand axis as a percentage of output, and you can read current expenditure, the blue line, off the left-hand axis. And again, you can see particular volatility as far as capital investment is concerned. Go back to the famous statement by our former Minister for Finance, who said, when I have it, I spend it, and when I don't, I don't. It's particularly true in an Irish context as far as capital expenditure is concerned. And that's what we see very clearly over the last 30, 35 years. Highly cyclical capital investment tending to be highly cyclical and following the cycle in terms of where the economy is at. So that inevitably is fed through into kind of infrastructural deficits. Okay, so if we just take our fairly standard growth accounting formula and then just, if you like, decompose the Irish performance over the various different subperiods that I've talked about. And we've also included the European Union here for comparative purposes, okay? And I think it's, you know, presents quite interesting results. So just again, to highlight the contribution, for instance, of capital here, you have the alpha before it and you have the 1 minus alpha before the contribution of labor, just in case people are a little bit just trying to work out the sums. But you can see, and I've just highlighted, for example, the 2020 to 2023 picture, just for, you know, just to focus on that. You can see very strong growth in output over that period. Mainly, I think, possibly due to the fact that we have a very strong presence here in Ireland, particularly of the pharma and ICT sectors, both of whom tended to perform very strongly coming out of COVID, even during COVID and coming out of COVID for relatively obvious reasons. But you can see the huge contribution that labour is making to that growth story. So it's, you know, of the huge increase in output, this is average annual. You can see labour contributing very strongly in the present period. Even if you go back to the initial Celtic Tiger phase, the top row in the table, where you had 4% growth per annum, again, you can see it's a strong contribution of labour, really, as far as the growth performance of the economy is concerned. And If you remember back the famous Honohan and Walsh paper back in around 2002, 2003, which essentially debunked the notion that the Irish Celtic Tiger story was a rapid productivity story. It wasn't. It was essentially a kind of a factor accumulation story. And you can see if you look at the contribution of TFP there, that almost is borne out by that very small contribution to the very strong growth at the time. But it was mainly coming from labour growth at the time. And if we look at something similar in terms of output per hour, labour productivity, again, you can see the contributions of total factor productivity and then capital deepening. What's interesting, I suppose, as far as the capital deepening is concerned, in recent times, of course, is a very negative contribution because the labour component growing far stronger than the capital and the investment component, therefore giving a negative contribution from capital deepening. So overall, for instance, output per hour actually declined quite a bit in the most recent period. But you can see for the period as a whole, from 2001 to 2023, you're getting near enough to 1% growth in output per hour over that period. Okay, just a word on the labour input, because we think this is quite important. We don't fully exploit this in the present paper, but we are looking at it in terms of other contributions. We break it out very much on a cohort basis. So we essentially take activity rates, the fraction of the population there on the right-hand side. We take it for each of the various different cohorts of the labour market from 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, 30 to 34, etc., all the way up to 70, 74, and 75 up. So that allows us to not just look at the overall total change in population, but also to look at the changes in the different cohorts of the population. And we do that for the various different population figures that we use, the baseline and then the two scenarios. Okay, so that allows us to look at the difference in changes in the cohorts, and I think that's quite important in terms of how the overall labour supply evolves. Then we're multiplying by, we get total employment from our expression here, and then total hours worked is total employment multiplied by the average hours worked per employee, the kind of weekly work rate. And if we decompose the growth in hours worked, again, Ireland, the top part of the table, the European Union at the bottom end. And really, I suppose what stands out is the huge contribution of things like population, more recently, participation rates, which have grown quite strongly since COVID. And we've seen that really, it's almost crept up on us really in terms of the short-term analysis that we do of the economy. But you can see a very strong contribution from participation rates, but also very strong contribution from population, both at present and back, we'll say, in the Celtic Tiger era. Whereas if you look and compare the European Union, you see far more modest contributions from population and indeed participation rates. Okay, so then our population levels, we have three that we use. Baseline is in blue. As I said, this is very much taking from and drawing from the work that Adele Bergen and Paul Egan did as far as their structural demand estimate of housing is concerned. So in our baseline population forecast, I think we're assuming that there will be a net increase, net inward migration of around 35,000 people per annum between now and 2030. And then it eases off to 20,000 people per annum from 2030 onwards. The high and the low migration are almost mirror images of each other. The high migration scenario is adding 10,000 onto that. Low migration is taking 10,000 off of it. The reason why we go out such a long way is just, I suppose, to show the way in which the demographic issue is eventually going to catch up with the Irish economy at some stage, or Irish society at some stage. So you can see the way the population levels are easing off, of course, depending on the particular scenario. Two other crucial assumptions as far as the unemployment or as far as the labour market is concerned, the unemployment rate. So the actual figures are in the white part of the graph. The grey part of the graph is the future, the forecast period. So you can see the Irish unemployment rate, again, very, very, very volatile over the period. The big persistent fall during the Celtic Tiger era. Then you have the very sharp increase after 2008. But then again, you have quite a persistent fall in the unemployment rate from around 2012, 2013 onwards. Many people at the time felt we'd have scarring effects, something similar to maybe what we experienced in the 1980s, but a radically different picture in terms of how quickly people got back to work after what was seismic shock of the financial crisis. You can see in our assumption, we're basically assuming the economy stays at the present low unemployment rate into the forecast period. That's quite an assumption to make. As I said, we do some robustness analysis around that, in particular volatility modeling, just to look and see, to stress test it, if you like, in terms of the ranges that may occur over the period. In terms of the average work week, we very much take the most recent estimate again, and we hold that constant as far as the future is concerned. So that's, again, our assumption as far as the average work week and the unemployment rate is concerned. And when we couple that with our population forecast, we get the following picture as far as future employment levels are concerned, depending on our underlying demographic assumptions. So on the baseline, you can see in blue, future labor levels. In green, you can see it under the low migration, and red under the high migration. What's interesting, and I think what bears out, if you like, the analysis or the reason in which we decompose the labor variable, is you can see that the flattening of the curve is occurring quicker than the underlying population forecast. The reasons for that is because of the changing nature of the population. The cohort analysis is allowing the older, if you like, the aging population to come into the analysis, and therefore you're having as I said, the curve is becoming flatter at an earlier stage as far as employment levels are concerned. Hours worked, we simply multiply by the average work week, so that gives us our total work week, our total labor supply. Okay, so again, just to recap the model, just from a forecasting perspective, again, standard Cobb-Douglas. The capital stock on a rolling inventory basis, our labor variable there, summarizing, if you like, the cohort analysis and participation rates in the working age population times the hours. And then we have our investment, which is our investment rate times output. And then our total factor productivity is growing at the rate of G, okay? And again, assumptions required both for the investment rate into the future and for total factor productivity growth. Now, what we do with the total factor productivity growth is and again, it's a very volatile and changeable variable, as you can see. We basically take the average from 1995 to 2019. So we exclude the COVID period because that resulted in some very, very sharp oscillations. That gives us a total factor productivity growth rate of 0.6% per annum, which, you can argue one way or the other, is it too high, is it too low? That's the rate we come at. That we use. We do again some stochastic modeling just to put bands around that. Surprise, surprise, the bands are quite wide, but nonetheless, it is an element, if you like, of rigor, just in terms of trying to put some bands around the assumptions that we make. On the investment rate for our baseline investment, we basically take the most recent rate, which is around 19%, okay, and just hold that out into the future period. Okay. That results in our output and output per worker forecast. There's not a whole lot you can glean for that, so I'll just go straight onto the table. And what that shows, when we put all of that together, so we put our baseline population forecast, our assumptions around total factor productivity, assumptions around the work week, assumptions around the investment rate, we get a growth in output of 2% per annum for the rest of the decade, from 2024 out to 2030. It modifies then down to 1.5%. From 2030 to 2040, and again, that's the population aspect kicking in, and then more moderating further from 2040 up to 2050. Output per hour is pretty much around the 1% mark over the forecast period, okay? So that's the baseline forecast from the model under the specific assumptions. What we do then, that's the capital output outcome. I won't spend a whole lot on that. Basically, this is to do with our assumption about the capital output ratio. It kind of gradually increases in the future period because the actual ratio is below the steady state at present, etc. What I'll move on to is the scenario analysis. So we do, as I said, two sets of scenario analysis. One is basically on the basis of the different population forecasts. So simply to trace through the effect of the high and the low migration scenario in terms of its impact on the forecast. And then the second set of scenario set of analysis we do is to look at investment. And again, for reasons I outlined at the start, we see a significant fall off investment in the economy for public finance related reasons as well as other related reasons after the financial crisis. So quite a sharp fall off in capital investment. between 2009 and 2017. My colleagues Alan Barrett and John Curtis edited a piece that we did looking at the National Development Plan and highlighting infrastructural deficits on the basis of that. And clearly what came out of that, the review of the National Development Plan published this time last year, was the identification of infrastructural deficits across various different aspects of the economy, mainly because of the faster than expected growth in population. But again, that was also falling back on the fall off in capital investment. So, a lot of, I suppose, domestic motivation, if you like, to look at higher investment rates. But of course, as well, as I said at the outset, you had the European Commission report earlier this year, or last year, chaired by Mr. Draghi, and that made very specific assumptions and specific requests, if you like, or policy recommendations as far as higher investment is concerned. So in total euro terms, talking about 750 to 800 billion, which would transmit into 4.5% of EU GDP in 2023. And specifically, they came up with two investment rates. So they said that investment rates should increase from 22% of GDP today to around 27% in around 2030, I think they identified as the timeline. So interestingly, they went for specific investment rates accompanying their analysis. And so basically what we did in our scenario is we came up with two investment rates. We said we would grow it from the present 19% to 25% by 2030, and then a more ambitious 30% of output by 2033, allowing an extra 3 years, if you like, for that. The reason we came up with this is simply almost graphical. So if we look at the baseline investment rate in blue, you can see it's a continuation of around the 19% that it's at present. The 30%, the more ambitious, if you like, scenario is basically taking you back to an investment rate which prevailed at the peak of the Celtic Tiger. So we just take that as a reference point and say, if we can get the investment rate back up to the rate at which it was at the peak of the Celtic Tiger, that's our uppermost scenario. And then almost an in-between scenario is to get it to a more modest, but still a higher rate of 25%. Okay, so what do all of those assumptions result in? That's just the fallout in terms of the capital stock. But if we just look at the results, so in terms of output per hour, due to the low and high migration, basically what we find is that the higher migration, the lower migration is almost kind of a symmetric replica of it. You can see it's adding around 0.2% per annum to the growth rate. Okay, so the high migration over the period is adding around 0.2% to the average annual growth rate over the period in question. If we look at the investment scenarios, we can see that scenario one, initially for the first 5 or 6 years of the present decade, adds just under 0.5%. And then as you move out into the second decade, 2030 to 2040, it reaches a maximum of 0.6%. Again, 0.6% per annum addition, if you like, to the growth rate, the underlying baseline growth rate. Scenario two, obviously, is more ambitious. And so particularly for the 2030 to 2040 period, it's adding almost a percentage point to growth, 0.9% per annum to the growth rate as a result of the higher investment rate of 30%, which, as I said again, was the peak essentially under the Celtic Tiger. So here we kind of combine both the baseline results and then the migration results in the top tier, based on migration, low and high. And then we have the two investment scenario results. And I suppose the key comparison point is under the baseline migration and baseline investment, we have our 2% growth for the remainder of the decade, 1.5% between 2030 and 2040, and then falling down to just over 1%. But if we go to our high migration and our high investment scenario, particularly over the 2030 to 2040 period, you're getting quite an addition to the baseline growth rate. So you're getting 2.6% per annum as opposed to 1.5%. And of course, when you think of that cumulatively, that's quite an increase in output levels in the economy over the period in question. So again, the contribution of higher investment and higher population in terms of the overall effect. Okay, key results and key policy, if we're keeping within my time. Lower growth rates certainly seem more likely over the coming period. We've had a unique period of growth in the Irish economy over the last 25, 30 years, albeit with significant volatility in between. Our scenarios indicate that increasing population investment could increase output by over 1% per annum. And higher investment itself could add up to 1% in terms of that overall contribution. Going forward, it's clear, though, that the relatively low pace of total factor productivity in the economy and that which we expect going forward will act as a significant drag, particularly on output per worker or output per hour in terms of labour productivity. In terms of the policies which one could identify to address, a lot of work already has been done looking at how productivity can be boosted amongst domestic indigenous firms in terms of spillovers from, we'll say, more productive elements within the economy, whether it's the multinational sector of the economy, how that can be transmitted to more indigenous firms. I think, again, from a policy, particularly from a government perspective point of view, consistent rates of investment in the domestic economy are something which, hopefully, if we can achieve, if investment can become more acyclical, and hopefully these investment vehicles that have been set up will enable that. And I suppose we are in a relatively unique position in terms of the public finances and being able to put significant amounts of money into those vehicles. So hopefully that will lead to more consistent rates of investment, unlike what we've seen in the economy over the past 25, 30 years. And more longer term, I suppose we need to think of policies which can offset the implications of demographic drag. And indeed, some interesting work done by the likes of Michael Clemens at the Peterson Institute, looking at such policies, for instance, in places like South Korea, where these policies have been adopted. And of course, these policies need not be mutually exclusive, and very often in terms of improving their effectiveness, the more that they can cross-pollinate, if you like. So some final thoughts. Historic growth rates really over the last period of time have been driven by increased population and particularly greater labour input. You like strong labour demand being provided essentially by the multinational and certain aspects of the indigenous economy. But in the future, if we are to maintain constant growth and consequently improve living standards, it will be challenging and require, a fairly imaginative policy response, particularly if we are to deal with the low productivity issue. And as I said, also address those issues around population and demographic drag. And as I said, interestingly, the work that Carl and I would have done over the years almost is a kind of a forecast to a certain extent where Europe is now, maybe where Ireland may well progress to in the years to come in terms of the kind of challenges that we face. Okay, with that, I'll conclude. We have quite a few slides on robustness analysis, etc., but maybe I'll leave that to discussion and questions. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much.
Quick one?
Yeah.
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, really interesting paper. Just to check my understanding on a couple of points. So in the elevated investment scenarios, essentially there's an assumption underlying it that the productivity of capital of this additional investment stays constant. So this isn't housing bubble, distortionary investment. This is decent quality investment. That's one thing. The other thing I wondered about was in your employment modeling, the cohort activity rates for each cohort are constant over time?
The cohorts vary because the forecasts of the population.
The cohort, each cohort, they vary from one another, but does each cohort keep its activity rate?
Its employment rate and things like that is we take the 2023, the most recent observed historical rate, we apply to going forward.
Okay, I was just wondering, wouldn't you expect to see life cycle effects?
Yeah, again, there's a lot that we could endogenize, if you like. I think particularly the point you make in relation to the productivity on the capital side is one very obvious one. I think it's quite a strong assumption to assert that just because you've increased investment, increased capital, etc., you're going to have the same effect going forward. Also, we've talked even about on the demographic side this notion of bringing more people in through population rates. Again, that's something that would arguably have productivity related effects. And on modeling the kind of employment rate, participation rate issues, which we keep constant in terms of the actual rates themselves going forward, again, that's something that you could do quite a lot of work on. So I suppose part of something when you take a kind of a broader term perspective like this, you do throw up a lot of kind of potential areas for future work, but they're all very, very relevant points.
All right, so we've two discussants, and then there's going to be lots of questions. Thanks, Tom. So Thomas from the central banks. See, it's just sorry about that. Yeah,
Sure. Thanks very much. Okay, thanks very much to the Society for the invitation to discuss the paper, and to Kieran and Donal and Paul for the paper and the presentation today. So overall, I enjoyed reading the paper. It's very well motivated, as you saw again today in Kieran's presentation. Very, very clearly described in terms of assumptions and methodology, and the results are very nicely linked into current policy debates. The two aspects in particular in terms of its relevance, a lot of the policy debate, as we know, tends to focus on day-to-day kind of shorter term issues, outlook over the next year or two, or even over the next 6 months. So I think the focus of this paper on a much longer term horizon is very welcome, and kind of encourages us to shift our focus to what are the key factors that will determine the longer term prospects for the economy out over the next decade and beyond. Secondly, if we leave out kind of external issues that are at play and potentially will affect the economy this year and over the coming years, probably the biggest domestic issue at the moment is around investment, the need to address the known infrastructural gaps in housing, in water and wastewater, energy and transport. So the focus of the paper in particular on investment and the investment scenarios is very welcome and well timed. And that's from an Irish perspective. We also know that at an EU level, as highlighted in the Draghi and prior to that, there's also a need to boost investment in the EU and in the euro area in particular, in order to lift what are very pretty dismal estimates of the potential growth rate of the EU economy. So the paper is very well situated and very well timed in the context of both Irish and EU issues at the moment. As somebody involved in short-term forecasting, it is useful to have this longer-term horizon. So we do our short-term forecasts from a demand side perspective, so what we think will happen to consumer spending, to investment. This paper looks at it from the supply side, and it gives all of us involved in short-term forecasting an idea of what the longer-term anchor for the economy is, so the longer-term outlook for the economy is, against which we can benchmark and anchor our shorter term forecasts. So that's also another useful contribution of the paper. In terms of the methodology, I don't have a huge amount to say on it, both in this slide or the following one. It's a very well known, clear solo growth accounting application that's used in the paper. So that has lots of advantages. It has some kind of disadvantages that I'll talk about in a moment, but it's certainly useful in that it's very clear from taking the data inputs and the methodology how the results are derived. There's no black box here. It's very, very transparent. So that's certainly a benefit. And also I think the authors are to be commended for the careful way they've gone about adjusting, as we all have to, the data inputs to account for the impact of multinationals on the Irish national accounts. So they're very clear in the exposition in the paper and in Kieran's presentation today as to how they've gone about doing that. And it's not always straightforward. Lastly, the paper considers obviously a very long time horizon, and even over a short horizon, any kind of central forecast for the economy has a lot of uncertainty around it. Over going beyond that, the uncertainty is significant. So the solution really there is to focus on a range of potential outcomes, which the paper does. And as I've mentioned already, the scenarios picked are particularly well chosen given current debates. So maybe I've a couple of comments here. Some of it is is certainly for future work. So as I said, there's not so much to go into in terms of the methodology. Really, what's crucial here is the combination of assumptions that applied, and that will give you the output as presented. So the comments are focused on some comments on the inputs that are used and potential ideas and options for changing some of the key labor, capital and productivity assumptions, and then more kind of general comments that are around the kind of limitations of this framework and how it could be complemented with some modifications to this framework, would maybe more importantly used alongside a different approach. So maybe just some kind of very narrow data points, and I can talk bilaterally to the authors about some of these. The approach is to take a measure of the capital in the papers, take a measure of the capital stock in 95 and then grow it forward with modified investment. I'm not sure whether the change I've proposed would make a significant difference, but there is a direct measure of the capital stock that can be calculated using data from the CSO, that you can adjust for globalization effects. The benefit of that over what's used in the paper is that it takes into account what are often important valuation changes in the capital stock. So that's maybe one just data change on the measurement of the capital stock in the paper we're considering. A point maybe Sean touched on in his comment. So I'm not going to go through each assumption, but I think one particular one that has the potential to alter some of the results that we saw is the assumption on the labour force participation rate. So as outlined, this is held unchanged from its 2023 value, but the labour force participation rate has been changing quite significantly. I just have one chart here, and this is just the change since 2015. So over a relatively short period, there's been a big change in the participation rate, particularly for women. And so in that period, it's gone up by over 6.5 percentage points and by about 2 percentage points for men. And some of this is just what we call cohort effects, that older age groups reflecting the effect of past educational attainment have higher participation rates than the same person 10 years ago. And we're seeing the benefit of that in the data over the last 5 years, and we expect that to continue. There's still more participation gains to come from that pure cohort effect that you can incorporate without too much difficulty into the participation rate assumption. So that might be just one thing to that might be worth just nuancing a bit further in terms of the participation rate assumption. On the investment scenario, so this is kind of moving a little bit more broadly into the interpretation of the results given the framework that's used. So the investment scenarios are again very useful to see. But through the framework, they allow us to say what the supply side effects of the investment is. So what's the effect on the potential growth of the economy? But of course, if we take, say, the first investment scenario in the paper, where investment is ramped up by 5 percentage points, you can imagine in the current circumstances and economy of full employment, that will have very material effects on the demand side. So it will boost employment, it will boost wages, inflation, and those effects in turn will feed back onto the supply side. There's also, won't go into it now, but there's also the fact of being in a monetary union. So the response usually might be that interest rates will rise. That won't happen in our case. So how do you, essentially the demand side effects of such an increase in investment are important to consider alongside the supply side. So that's just maybe something worth kind of noting or discussing a little bit more in the paper. Again, another issue that we all know about, the multipliers across different types of public investment vary significantly. So the type and the quality of the increase in investment that's considered is important, and again might be just worth noting. One area where we know that large increases in investment will be needed, between 1.5% and 2% of national income a year out to 2030, is to finance the transition to net zero. So in that respect, given the importance of energy investment in the energy area, it might be worth considering separating out energy as a separate factor of production in the system. Another point that's maybe a little bit more doable than the one I just mentioned is to consider, so we know in the Irish economy, there's a big difference between this large multinational dominated fast growing sector and then a much more slowly growing domestic firms. Using CSO, the splits of CSO data that are available, I think it would be, while keeping obviously the aggregate results, I think it would be possible to split the model into one where multinational dominated and domestic sectors are considered separately. And I think that would be particularly important if we were thinking about the role of TFP, for example. The multinational sector has much stronger TFP growth than, say, the domestic sector. And in considering kind of future scenarios and the impact of things like AI, having the multinational and the domestic sectors modeled separated out within the same framework might be, I think, a nice addition to be able to tell more of a sectoral story. I'll not really go into the external demand side, but as you can see, it doesn't feature so much in this type of setup. It's there in the background, but there's the potential for changes in the external environment to have a significant impact on the long-term growth of the economy. So I think that kind of goes maybe a little bit with the comment here on the demand side effects, that it may be worth the mention of some of these things. One kind of simple thing I thought that would be nice to see in the paper, and I think very easily incorporated, would be to show the results from the different scenarios in terms of incomes per head or output per head. It's very useful to see the growth rate results, but ultimately what we all care about is welfare and the implications for living standards. And I think just showing the results divided by the population in each scenario would be very nice to see. One, as you have seen from the presentation, this type of framework allows for static analysis, and I think Sean touched on this, where in the case of the investment scenario, only investment is changed in that. So investment is hiked up, but the population and TFP is assumed to be the same as it was in the baseline. Now, we know in reality that if we manage to increase investment to 30% of output, in all likelihood, that would have an effect on TFP itself. So TFP would probably rise. It might enable higher inward migration, for instance. So you can't, in this type of framework, kind of take account of all of those interactions. One kind of simple, cheap thing that could be done, but I wouldn't stress it too much, might be just simply to run some of the scenarios that Kieran presented in the paper together. So run the higher population with higher TFP and higher investment. But I wouldn't push that too much, because you still kind of can't get around too much the static nature of the analysis, which leads me to the final point, which is that this is very useful as a framework, and it has lots of advantages as in terms of being very transparent. But I think it would be very, Kieran mentioned the economic outlook, which ESRI work on. I think this would be a nice complement to that work, in that the outlook relies on a general equilibrium model. So it takes into account both those demand and supply interactions that I talked about, that really bring you kind of closer to the economic kind of reality of the impact of these changes considered. So I leave it there, and congratulate again Kieran, Paul and Donal on the work.
So again, apologies for the all-male panel, but it was just when we were organizing things last night, we realized we'd no discussants, and it's just myself and Thomas were brave enough to make the comments. We knew the point is we both knew this paper, so it was kind of hopefully relatively easy for us to jump in at the last minute. I know there's lots of people want to ask questions, so let me just very quickly, the things that hit me. So again, lovely paper, written beautifully. And this basic point about the demographic drag, as you call it, and also, the under-investment, capital investment, public investment is very well taken. And I think you draw that out quite nicely in the work that's done. But okay, so let me just, the things that hit me. There's a literature out there modeling, doing kind of solo growth accounting, solo decompositions, on global supply chains. And particularly, I'm going to talk about maybe food. And you actually see the observable factors of production like land, labor, capital, raw materials, and all of them not really getting a great rate of return. And what's happening is the TFP, the unobservable bit, seems to be just moving over the decades from 30 to 40 to 50 to 60%. And everyone's going, what is this? Right? Joe Stiglitz calls it unearned income. You know, people are just getting money for nothing, you know. But I actually think there's something in that. There's an asset in there, digital asset, like digital highways, licensing, those who are looking after all the logistics, communications, et cetera, they own those things. And it is a factor of production, and they are getting a return. And that the return to tech is actually getting bigger than the way we think about the return to labor and return to capital or even return to land. Okay. So in a sense, one type of question I have here is that there's the traditional factors of production, but now let's talk about this new one, you know, the AI one, the robot, you know, like this is something new, and it's generating a lot of lock-in on productivity and how we're modeling that. In this type of paper, obviously, TFP is the unobservable and it's very exogenous. But I'm just kind of wondering, are we making any attempt to measure those digital assets at all, right? As a very tangible thing. The second thing, I think, if this is the splitting out the multinational sector from the domestic. You know, I think it's fine to get, you know, more than fine, a lot of good work on this NNP and then the adjusted investment sequences. And I know the purpose of it here, I guess, to say, well, what is really the real economy that affects people in Ireland, and this distortion of rent shifting or something? It's not real growth, it's not real investment, you know, we really have to get at it. But I kind of believe, and we saw it in the paper a couple of weeks ago, that there's a lot of linkages between these type of sectors. So a lot of our so-called Irish exporters are exporting intermediate parts. A lot of what's going on with multinationals is intermediates. There's lots of linkages between the two. And even when we're looking at employment, which I don't think was adjusted in this paper, they do say that every job loss in multinational is like 10 jobs elsewhere, right? You know, the pizza delivery people, etc. You know, so when I was looking at the kind of TFP change in TFP versus change in L versus change in K, it's just remarkably small, actually, the TFP. And I'm just kind of wondering whether the cut out of the overall output and cutting out the distortions, as you call it, out of the investment sequences, a little bit too crude, right? And it's putting a lot on labor then and a lot on the capital assets. And I think TFP is bigger than this. And even in the domestic context, I actually think it's bigger than this. It's just something to think about. And actually might be a way of modeling this different scenarios on total factor productivity or the soda residual, where we kind of link it to what could happen with Trump's tariffs or their external demand or this, that there's something, those linkages could be kind of interesting to say that this is a bit more endogenous than we think. On the labor side, I like the cohort analysis and the whole demographic drag idea. But of course, then the minute you talked about the energy transition and the digital transition, everyone is really worried about upskilling and reskilling of the labor force. So like, what is the quality? And even with immigration, it's like, what is the quality of the labor force? And they have the appropriate skills for the future. And that's not something, it's hard to understand this, right? I think we've been lucky. A lot of our migration has been high skilled, and it's been targeted at the needs of the Irish economy. But, you know, quantity of labor and cohorts and quality of it, you know, we'd want to worry about that, right? And I think it's something universities have to worry about. So it's not just, we're not just putting.
Trump too, it's even worse.
Trump's listening. It's you know, we feel we're under investing in public infrastructures for digital transfer, like energy, for housing, for hospitals, but you know, the big one, human capital, right? What's the sort of investment we're putting in that? And it's not just the young people, it's the upskilling of the labor force to deal with these transformations. So all of these can be incorporated, of course, into the paper. And then the last point I'm going to make, and then I'll open up the floor, is land. So, you know, part of me, when you see 70% of Ireland covered by agriculture, that's land, and then we've got multinationals who can buy residential property and buy up the land, even for housing. It just strikes me at a growing population, etc. You just kind of wonder, like, is land not an asset? Should we not be thinking about returns to land and alternative land use? And how would that really feed into a decomposition like this? Because if you're in Africa, that'd be the first thing you'd have in your modeling of an economy. You'd look at land and land use and ownership, etc. But it's not even here. But to me, land has become completely precious in Ireland, and it's feeding into every aspect. So I kind of wonder about that. Okay, so there are my few points. And I'm going to open it up to the floor. So I try to be fair to the online. So if people are online, I'll just alternate. People online, you can put up your hand or I'll call out, but I'll take the room first and then we'll alternate. We'll just try and gather as many questions as possible. And then we see Kieran can pick and choose and what he wants to address. So anyone here want to go first? Go first. Say your name and yeah.
Brian Hughes, and I'm with my colleague Damien Courtney. We both sat for this century on 4 out of 5 of the CSO expert groups on population migration and labor force projections.
Wonderful, yeah.
And also other hats on, I'm a chartered surveyor and town planner and demographer. And I'm very interested in the idea that we could immediately add to the investment side by 5 to 10 billion a year if the public policy strategy, now the opportunity of the new government, were to change. We've seen in the last couple of years very disappointing figures last week of housing production, 30,300 a year. But that is largely attributable to the fact that apartment developments, as Paul Mitchell described in RTE this morning, are non-viable, but also because of other steps that could be taken on the public policy issue, specifically rent restrictions. It's frightened away totally, almost, the foreign investors. We need quickly to get from 30,000 to 60,000 housing units a year. ESRI have done very interesting work on the dangers which this might have in terms of foreign direct investment, such investment. And I feel that this discussion tonight and the excellent paper that we produced really help, as it were, to bridge the gap, the theory and the practice gap. And I must say, as somebody who's been working on the housing side of things for a long period of time, with my experience in the property market, etc., that there is so much we can do if we get our act, if we manage to get our policy changed, particularly on the rent. I mean, the effect of the 1967 and 1960 Rent Restrictions Acts is well known and had a huge effect on the property markets of that era. And I don't think yet we know the extent to which the rent restrictions now that we imposed in the last year or two, the huge effect that has had in frightening off foreign investors.
Yeah, very good. Kieran's there, he's taking notes, so he'll come back. Frank, online, Frank Barry.
Hi, Paul, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect, yeah.
Grounds, thanks. I want to follow up really on a question that both of the discussants raised. Thanks for the paper, by the way, Kieran. How would you model a Trump scenario, which could entail either, deglobalization or a specific targeting of the use of Ireland as a platform for US multinationals? Thanks.
Very good question. I'll come back to the room. Who wants to go in the room? Oh, go ahead, Chris. And then, yeah.
Three questions, I guess. So my most interesting bit about this whole scenario building is about the population, net inward migration. And I guess 10 years ago, we got that wrong. We missed all the inward, the returning Irish migrants. We just didn't see them coming into all our models. And I guess, the 80,000 Ukrainians coming in now, we didn't have that in a model either. And I think I'm really interested in your views, Kieran, on, should we be looking at the high baseline models for that now, given the upside we've had kind of twice with these cohorts coming in of high skilled, improving the skill base in Ireland from the migration flows. And then we're very conscious of CSO has higher population projections than Eurostat has. I wonder which ones are being used in the model. The second of three questions really is about, NMP is a great measure to use. We're putting our eggs in the basket of NNI, the national income, almost the same thing. That we're talking to other countries about, is that the one to use, a deglobalized measure for that the whole world can produce NNI. So we think that's a good one. It does lead us down the path a little bit about if you start taking out some of the multinational effects that we don't like, what country has these in their productivity, right? So is this global data just going to disappear from the globe and no one's going to show it? And that leads into Paul's point. You have a really good point there, and which is kind of my third issue around the next set of standards for us. We have looked at that about, where is this value added being generated from? We toyed with what to call that item, that global value chains item, the tech item, and we played with a term what we call marketing assets, or brand names, goodwill, all that residual value that's on a balance sheet of a company if you want to take it up to market value. We couldn't agree it internationally, and we've dropped that one off the agenda. But we did stick with another one, which was data. So we're going to value data as an asset. So for the tech companies, we're going to put a value on that, and that'll go into the capital stock. We've agreed that one. How we're going to do it, we've got another 2 years to going to work on that yet, but that'll be in the capital. So all the capital stock values we'll produce from 2029 will have a value for data as an asset in there, so that the value that essentially the tech companies here derive of whatever it is they do here and all these massive sales into Europe. So certainly we'll put those capital stock estimates, and we'll try our very best to run that back to 1995 if we can get it into the full time. Thanks, Kieran.
Mary Doyle. Thank
Mary,
you. Kieran. Yeah. I'm just wondering about the short term, really. I know this is an overview looking into the longer term, but from my point of view, I think we're heading for serious trouble. That you did see positive growth over the next 5 years. Like we were talking here about housing, the figures aren't really there. It's not going to happen. Pharmaceutical companies have been reducing their outputs the last while, so the taxes are going to be down, government income won't be even. Like Glendiplex today is letting people off because their market for heat pumps. I would have thought there's a world market for heat pumps, but they're not selling either. Trump has, what he's doing, and but like external economists, things are going to go wrong in the US. The UK are second, and other big markets. That's really in serious trouble too. So the tech companies in Ireland have been laying off staff. We've got wars around there, but there's going to have to be major recovery. So I'm just wondering, what do we see in the short term? Because there were positive growth signals for the next 5 years or so, but I'm not as optimistic, unfortunately.
Yeah. Anyone online? It's your chance before I kick it back to Kieran. All right, so maybe do you want to come up here, and then if people have other thoughts, they can come at you again.
Yeah, first of all, just really thanks very much for the range of questions and suggestions. I think a lot of the time I've just jotted down these rough notes just to kind of keep me so that I can kind of touch on as many of the points that were raised. I think in terms of Thomas's comments, easily knowing you wrote a very similar paper quite recently, so you're very familiar with all the issues. So, again, I would agree with just about everything that you had said. I think, we did think about, more from, I suppose, future perspective. the issue of maybe separating out energy, I think, is a very useful point. I suppose the old chestnut of the M&E versus the rest of the economy, although I think Paul's points are well made, that there is actually quite a degree of intersection between the two sectors. So you are kind of run the risk of separating out there in that sense. I think the suggestion on even relatively straightforward on output per head, I mean, why didn't we put it in? Put it in a chart. Very, very good point. And I think that the issue, and again, it touches back on what Sean was suggesting, endogenizing some of the kind of the assumptions, obviously, that were made, particularly interrelationships, as you say, between capital, labor, etc., the participation rate issue, which is a very relevant point, the contribution of investment, marginal investment, if you like, versus average investment, etc. I think those are all very, very, very well made points. And your final point, I think, is a very important point from our perspective, which is, in terms of the process of an economic output, we are currently re-estimating Cosmo, and consequently, the aim of this would be to align in some shape or form the kind of potential output forecast from this with Cosmo and to interact. And Paul, my co-author, is currently working on Cosmo. So I think there's very clear overlap there in terms of the intersection between the two. Just with Paul's points, I think, again, very much agree. I mean, I think the TFP issue is fascinating, and it's something that exercised a lot of our thinking, particularly when we were looking at the European data and the work with Carl. And you go back and read contributions from people like Bob Gordon, taking a kind of, I suppose, quite a pessimistic view in terms of the contribution of TFP to growth in the longer run. The kind of classic points that Gordon makes is that it's not that there's any shortage of innovation out there, it's just its contribution to output is much more reduced now than what it was. And of course, he makes the point about the development of elevators and how that facilitated huge cities and densely packed cities, if you like, and jet airplanes. And these all had a huge impact on growth because of their seismic contributions. But that maybe the contributions aren't as pronounced. But I do very much take the point that it could well be an issue of measurement. And I think that is something that has something that we've taught a lot about. I think the only point I would make is, and I do take the point about when you strip out the investment, and this is again going to some of the point that Chris makes, if you strip out too much, where do you draw the line between you're losing information, relevant information, versus you obviously don't want to be including distortionary information in terms of the kind of estimates and calculations that you're doing. I suppose the one reassuring point we'd say about the TFP, and as you pointed out, being very small, is that it seems to be correlating with what we saw and found when we looked at the European data in relation to this point. Also, maybe another small little check on that is in terms of the robustness analysis that we did. I said we were particularly concerned with the volatility around TFP. So we did do a model of TFP. Paul did it indeed, where we basically, if you like, slightly loosened some of the assumptions around the solo TFP, in that we linked the Irish estimate, and particularly the forecast of the Irish estimate of TFP, to a forecast estimate that was available from NISR and work that they do with NIGEM in the UK. And again, if you take that relationship, of Irish productivity estimates being somewhat related to the UK, again, maybe a relationship that has weakened over time, but nonetheless does give us a certain kind of robustness check there. We also actually do something very similar as far as the unemployment rate is concerned. And we take a kind of a well-known contribution that Patrick Monahan estimated some years ago, where he looked at Irish unemployment and the relationship with the UK market. And we use those models basically to do some stochastic work, draw on the distributions from the models then and put those bands around our forecast. So again, we are kind of inching towards some of that kind of robustness and some of those issues that I think you're talking about there. I think the quality of the labour force, very much a very relevant question, something that was raised by a referee. And again, something that we could look at possibly more as kind of future work in terms of broadening out the kind of horizon, if you like, on the work, or the scope of the work, and particularly the land. And I think that relates very nicely then and dovetails very nicely into the kind of the housing questions that have come up, which I think are hugely relevant, because we do a lot of work on housing, and we do kind of think a lot about it, and we do try and relate, if you like, the overall aggregate perspective with how does that feed into the housing market. And I think it does augur from a policy perspective, I suppose, there is this huge issue in the housing market of what we call the finance gap, which is the difference between the kind of lending that's going on out there and how many units that would sustain versus the number of units that are required. And people are, the figures are somewhere between 55 and 60,000 units per annum. You're now at just over 30,000 units. There is a big funding gap there. We think some of the kind of investment funds and some of the kind of the public purse and the improvement in the public purse, I think certainly can play a role and is already playing a role. But I think one policy recommendation, specific recommendation we would make in relation to that is we do need to emphasize the efficiency of the public contribution and that we bring measures in which essentially to crowding in of investment as far as particularly housing is concerned and other areas of public infrastructure. There is a lot of funds available, but we must underpin that with a need for value for money and getting the most significant contribution that we can from that. And I think the crowding in of investment in the housing space, you do see it a little bit already with the likes of the Land Development Agency have a couple of schemes running where they are matching and encouraging, if you like, private sector development. That is possibly some kind of a template, particularly in the housing space. On Frank Barry's point, which I think is a fascinating point, on how would you model Trump, how would you model the economic implications of the Donald Trump presidency, I suppose. This is work we're actually ongoing. Paul Egan is doing quite a lot of work at present on deglobalization scenarios for work that we do for the Department of Finance, actually looking at this. If Paul wants to make a comment on that, but that is work that is underway. I think the really interesting issue, and we did talk a lot about this from the shorter term perspective, and it goes back to the comments you made. We did spend a lot of time in the recent commentary trying to envisage the implications of Trump in the second Trump presidency. And we outlined kind of schematically how we saw it impacting, whether it's through the tariffs, the impact on global trade, which obviously has implications for ourselves. But then obviously there's the other more specific issue of the pharma, and and members of his administration have specifically pinpointed pharma, the possibility of onshoring pharma back to the US, which would obviously have an impact if you're thinking of it mechanically in the solo perspective on things like capital and investment, albeit if we are, trying to control for some of the multinational related issues there, there's no doubt if you had a significant onshoring of pharma capital back to the US, that would come through the framework in that sense. But I think probably the more specific impact of Trump on what we talked about is the implications for investment in terms of public investment. There's no doubt if you did have that kind of huge effect of onshoring pharma back to the US, it would have very significant implications for the public purse, and particularly for corporation tax receipts. And the capacity of some of these investment funds would be seriously stretched, I think, in such a scenario. So I think it's more, how would we fund the likes of an increase in investment to 25 to 30% are the issues which would arise there. The one caveat with Trump, just to note, is of course that the last time out, we were all very, very concerned about what he would do, particularly from the multinational and the corporation tax perspective. But of course, the net effect of what he did was to actually boost corporation tax receipts here in Ireland. Not saying that that's going to happen again, but it does highlight that there is a significant difference very often with most politicians, but particularly in the case, I think, of Mr. Trump, of what he says he's going to do and what the intended purpose of what he does and what he actually does and what the actual outcome of that is. And it clearly led to a lot of greater incentives to offshore activity last time around. And you can see it in the data. I mean, huge spike, in the trade deficit between Ireland and the US in terms of pharma. So it's a hugely important, complex question, hugely important one. And I think it's got a variety of different channels through which you can operate. Chris's points, again, the inward migration on the baseline assumption, it's the 35,000 plus net inward migration is our assumption for the baseline. And then 10,000 above that for the higher migration, 10,000 below for the lower migration. I mean, this is work mainly coming, I suppose, from Adele Morgan, who would obviously tune in a lot, tie in a lot with your own work on the demographics. That's the basic population assumption there. And again, I think your point about losing the TFP component on the NNI, or in taking too much out of the national accounts in terms of trying to address the multinational distortions, I think is very, very well made. And I think the final point about again, going back to the housing and the pharmaceuticals, there's no doubt that the housing is a very, very pressing issue, and it is striking, I suppose. The anecdote I'd like to tell is that when we were preparing the autumn commentary, we had our forecast of 32,000 housing units per annum, and I was listening to Morning Ireland when the Taoiseach said very staunchly that there would be 40,000 units. And we said we better go back and check our spreadsheets, but we stuck to our guns, fortunately. You know, there's no doubt that, and again, estimates today suggesting we get only 30,000 this year. You know, that is so much below what we actually need. And unfortunately, that does push upward pressure. And it's very hard to see, you know, house prices and rents obviously tied by the rent pressure zones, but certainly house prices going any way other than going up, I'm afraid, in the present context. So I think that is, those are very well made. And so hopefully I've touched on most of
Very comprehensive, yeah, well done. Maybe just one or two questions. We'll try and finish around 6:30. So Michael Darcy, do you want to come on and keep your hand up there?
Yeah, so my compliments on a very comprehensive paper, and it's usefully very long term. So as government investment commitments include for a shared island, do you agree it would be useful to similarly model all island demographics and for the same time horizons, which I note goes as far as 2080?
Yeah, it gives me an opportunity to plug, I suppose, a good bit of ESRI work that is looking at issues increasingly, you know, through the shared island and through our partnership with IBEC. We've recently developed an all-island model of the economy, both north and south. And obviously on the shared island, we've been doing an increasing amount of all-Ireland work. So I do think that is important because obviously it is a key policy change which could come about. In terms of possible potential unification at some point, and it is crucially important, I suppose, as we've seen with the major policy changes elsewhere in the world, noticeably Brexit, that if you are going to engage in significant, you know, constitutional change or reform, etc., that you have the analysis there that underpins it. So, you know, as I said, we have the recent work done with IBEC on an all-Ireland model, and we have quite a lot of work done across a variety of areas, including housing, actually, in terms of looking at issues from an all-Ireland economy. So I would, you know, yes, certainly, I think it is important to go out as far as you can, particularly on the demographic issue, because you can really see when those factors start to kick in.
John, where's John? Do you have something to announce?
Just to add at the end, yeah. No,
Yeah.
thanks, Kieran.
Oh yeah, Francis first, and then we'll.
Sorry,
Yeah.
just
yeah.
very briefly. I just wanted to hear whether we can do this, but I mean, a lot of discussion about pharma, and pharma is obviously one of the big issues, particularly with Trump. But do we know enough about the supply of pharmaceutical products into Europe that's either coming from within Europe versus coming from the United States? Because I'm very struck by the massive restructuring of the pharma industry in the 1990s, which nobody anticipated, which happened on foot of the single market. So you didn't have to locate a pharmaceutical outlet in every country, because once there was a similar standard across Europe, they all did all these massive mergers and restructuring, huge restructuring over the whole 1990s. So I'm just wondering, do we know enough to know whether or not, you know, we're supplying a lot of pharmaceuticals into the States, so Trump could try to stop that. But I mean, to what extent are we taking in pharmaceuticals from the States? And given that it's the same companies on both sides of the Atlantic, I'm just wondering, can we know that?
Yeah, I can go with that for you. Like, so the big question now is about the 60 billion or so that's produced out of Ireland. There are global production sites. So in the 90s, we honed European production here, but now it's kind of one global production site for a drug. It's more efficient. And the discussion is really about the big chunk that we export through Puerto Rico into the US. Now that maybe we should bring home that production, but of course, these global production sites are producing all the drugs for Europe too. I don't think you could move all of that to the US and expect Europe to allow them to flow back in without it. So we might lose the US bit, but the European bit looks fairly safe.
And it might be the case that depending on who Trump fights with, we might do some of the global bit out of Europe rather than out of the States. I mean, it's the one huge question mark. I mean, and also with pharma, it'll be a while before we know. That's why your long-term scenario thing is interesting, because given the investments they've made, they're not putting out production anytime soon. But they can restructure outputs very quickly and restructure export markets very quickly. So it does seem to me it's an Irish and European and American data thing, and I've forgotten about the Puerto Rican element to it as well, which would have an effect.
Very good.
Okay, wrapping up next time, February 27th. We have a paper by Dermot Coles, Harry Williamson, Shannon Enright, and Karen Hogan, and that's on changing patterns of secondary employment in Ireland. And we're doing this one in Cork, hosted by the CSO, arranged by Chris. Thank you, Chris.
Okay. So thanks. Okay.
Have you ever actually, or your colleagues, done a retrospective assessment on the medium long term projections? So how would you kind of score them?
How would you score them? Yeah, it's a good point. I think we've done them more on the shorter term forecasts, actually, I think, than the longer term ones. I as I said during the presentation, if you go back to even the medium term outlook or medium term review as it was back in 2010, 2011, you know, there's no doubt that it's probably far more pessimistic than what was envisaged. I don't think anybody could have quite the turnout, but certainly, no, I mean, that as I said, I think it's more the shorter term forecast where there's been a kind of a more work going on evaluating their accuracy otherwise.
Right. Thanks.
Very good. All right, so we'll wrap up. Thanks for coming out. An excellent paper. And thanks for.
Yeah, I just like your comments recorded in the journal to please type them up and send them to email address, John.
Yeah, JEVANS Jevons@cnan.ie.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Hey, thanks everyone online. See you next time.